Give me a little intro there, Gomer.
There's no turning back now.
Let's put on the show.
You're listening to the Station 71 podcast. My name is Mario, and this week I'm joined by my co-host,
Beth,
Brian,
and Kirsten.
So this week we've got the continuation of our bio of Walt Disney. As is typical for the last couple weeks, no new news. But when we hear something, we will talk about that. I'm going to turn this over to Brian right away, unless you guys have anything else you want to talk about on air. I was going to say, I'm going to take the silence as a nope.
I'm just ready to hear the next part of Walt's biography.
Yeah.
Biography, rather.
Alrighty. Well, if you guys remember last time, Walt and the Disney Brothers studio had been in works with Charles Mintz, who was basically a middleman between the studio and Universal to produce a number of these Alice comedy shorts. So we'll pick up from there. But we'll actually pick up with something much different. Since moving to California, Walt had paid little attention to women, instead spending most of his time wrapped up in his work. This was not, however, out of place. In fact, his friend Walt Pfeiffer said Walt had never been one to chase women, even as a teenager and during his time in France. Mr. Disney put it very simply, girls bored me. While he courted a few girls throughout his young adult life, none of them would have been considered a serious relationship. By early 1924, Walt was doing his best to pull in help to the Disney Brothers studio. It was during this time that Lillian Banks had moved from Idaho to LA to visit her sister Hazel. Hazel had a friend who had taken a job at the studio painting cells. Walt and Roy had approached her to see if she knew anyone looking for a job, and she went to Lillian with an offer to recommend her for a position. Lillian thought that it would be nice to take a job within walking distance from her sister's house, so she agreed. Near the end of January, she signed on to help paint cells at $15 per week. Later in the year, Walt had saved up enough money to purchase a car, a Moon Roadster, of which he became quite proud. He began giving rides home to Lillian and another co-worker, even though Lillian could have easily walked home herself. She observed that Walt would always drop the other woman off first, even though it seemed that he had to go out of his way to do so. During these rides home together, the two began making connection. Eventually, before dropping her off one night, Walt asked Lillian if she would be willing to see him socially if he went out and bought a new suit, to which she accepted. Roy told Walt he could use $35 of the company money to buy a new suit, an allowance to which Walt did not stick.
Surprise, surprise.
Yes, always the one to overspend. Soon after, the two began seeing each other regularly. Lillian remarked that all of a sudden, Walt was at our house an awful lot. The two would take long drives in the Moon Roadster, frequently through the California orange groves. Lillian noted that Walt spent much of his time talking about the future he planned for the studio and what he hoped to accomplish through it. All the while, Lillian remained working at the studio. Walt joked that she made so many mistakes while there that he would have to marry her to relieve the studio of her. Walt approached her and asked if he should take his earnings and buy a new car or a ring, to which she replied, a ring. On July 13th, 1924, the two took a steamer to Lillian's brother's house in Seattle and tied the knot. So, I love this story. I thought it was kind of cute. His little, I don't know, I feel like he was being nice to give everybody a ride home, but it seemed like he was specifically giving the other person a ride home just to not make it so obvious that he wanted to give Lillian a ride home.
That is kind of cute.
Back at the studio, things were looking up. The Alice comedies were receiving great reviews from multiple critics, and Walt was even in talk with publishers about a tie-in book series. He began looking into an expansion for the studio, but more money was needed. Charles Mintz had put the studio on a film per 3-week schedule, but the contract stated that payment could occur whenever the films were delivered. In order to fast track the expansion, Walt put his employees on a schedule to turn out a movie every 2.5 weeks in order to receive more funds. This decision, however, led to a rift forming between Disney and Charles Mintz. Mintz initially refused to pay for the films in advance if they were delivered early, and Walt threatened to take the films to another distributor if the funds remained unpaid. Not wanting to lose the films, Mintz agreed to a new contract with Walt, paying $1,500 per film and a 50-50 split of profits over $3,000. This quelled Walt's desires for only a short period of time. Mintz was still incessant about controlling the content of the films. Walt again threatened to walk away if he was not given complete control over the creative process, to which Mintz refused. Walt was ambitious, and even without a distributor for the Alice comedies, he moved the company to a larger studios on Hyperion Avenue. At this point, he also changed its name to Walt Disney Studio. He poured $3,000 into renovations upon purchasing it. There's only one problem, though. Technically, Charles Mintz owned the right to the Alice comedies, and he'd give them to another studio to produce. However, not wanting to make changes to the films that were performing so well critically, he went back to the negotiating table with Walt. When all was said and done, the two agreed to a contract that would provide less upfront money, but give Walt control over the content of the films. And this is something that you'll definitely see with Walt through his career. He made a lot of probably financially and just business relations, like bad decisions, but he was adamant about having control over the creative process of the films he was producing. Though the dispute with Mintz was resolved, a new rift had formed between Walt and many of his employees. Walt was under stress from his negotiations with Mintz, as well as the financial state of the studio. Though they were receiving more money for the films, with a growing company and new studio, Walt was just scraping by. With his demand for an expedited schedule, a short temper, and little patience for even minor mistakes, many of the animators at the studio began to resent him. By early 1927, Mintz had decided that the Alice comedies were nearing the end of their lifetime. He was in negotiations with Universal to produce a new animated series and turned to Walt to create just that. One of Universal's main stipulations was that they wanted an animal, but not a cat, as they felt that many of the cartoons of the day were merely copying the success of Felix the Cat. With help from Up Iwerks, Walt came back with something new and exciting for a series of 26 short films, a rabbit named Oswald. Walt's vision for Oswald would form a foundation for many more characters he created over his lifetime. While most cartoon characters merely served as vessels for gags, Walt wanted Oswald to have a distinct personality that would develop over the series. He wanted the gags that occurred in the films to occur organically instead of being forced upon him. Just as he had done with the Alice comedies, Walt wanted to develop stories with the creations. He wanted his animations to have depth.
Can I just say that I think it's really funny that they wanted not a cat because they didn't want to copy Felix the Cat, but how similar Oswald looks anyway.
Very similar.
Kind of defeats the purpose, but anyway.
Oswald's design was met with great approval. By utilizing his long, unique facial expressions, the studio was able to convey Oswald's emotions far better than other cartoons had. The animators would twist, stretch, and elongate his body in different directions in order to exaggerate his reactions to a scene. In comparison to other cartoons of the day, Oswald was revolutionary, and the critics did not miss out on that fact. Again, scoring high praises, Walt saw his dream of success in the not-so-distant future. By the end of the year, Walt had brought in more animators and cel painters, bringing the total number of employees to 22. Walt was pulling in $100 per week at the studio. On top of that, by year's end, he had earned an additional $5,000 in bonuses on the profits from the Oswald cartoons. Walt and Roy both took their earnings and purchased lots in the Silver Lake districts of LA and began building houses. Thanks to Oswald, Walt had finally been able to bring a semblance of stability to the studio, but this would be short-lived. As much of any time we see some success in
And
Walt's
there it
career,
goes.
it's short-lived. While Walt Disney Studio had done outstanding work on the Oswald cartoons, netting both themselves and Charles Mintz a healthy profit, Mintz had grown tired of Walt's haggling over their pay. As far as he saw it, since Walt wasn't even the one drawing anymore, he was nothing more than a middleman, and he had become an annoying one at that. Walt also was...
How dare you?
Walt also wasn't aware that George Winkler, who Mintz had sent to work at the studio the previous year, was actually there for a more nefarious task. Winkler had been going to each of the animators behind Walt's back to see if they would be willing to leave the studio when the contract for Oswald was up for renegotiation. Even after Ub Iwerks went to Walt to tell him that Winkler had approached him with a proposition, Walt shrugged it off, believing his animators were loyal and would not leave him.
They did him so dirty.
So dirty. In actuality, many of the animators were already looking for a way out. Walt's attitude and lack of patience were described as borderline abusive by many of his employees at this time. After being pushed to the brink with expedited schedules on both the Alice comedies and Oswald for seemingly no reason, the majority saw Winkler's proposal as quite enticing. George approached Hugh Harmon, who had worked with Walt for years, and asked him if he would be willing to run the new studio with any of the animators that would leave. Harmon was all too eager to accept. In February of 1928, Mintz had renewed his contract with Universal to produce the Oswald cartoons for the next 3 years. Upon hearing the news, Walt took it upon himself to travel to New York with Lillian to negotiate a pay increase for his studio, none the wiser to what was going on behind his back. After meeting with Mintz, Walt was offered a contract to continue producing the Oswald cartoons, but for only $1,400 per film. He was currently making $2,250 per film. Appalled, Walt left and almost immediately went to both MGM and Fox to negotiate deals to produce films for them instead. So, yeah. Mintz was more or less saying, hey, we don't need you anymore, so here's this really lowball offer, take it or get out of the way.
Yikes.
That's crazy.
I mean, he did have the last laugh, so...
He certainly
And
did.
that's like the one thing that I know I've said this before, but I kind of wonder like if later down the line these people look back at this and we're like, oh man, we really did screw Walt Disney.
I feel like they had to, I mean, and even Mintz gets it pretty good later on, but yeah, I mean, obviously nobody at the time would know what, the Disney company would turn into, but they have to have been kicking themselves after what it did.
Yeah.
Walt wired Roy to tell him that a break with Mintz was imminent and that he should draw up contracts immediately for the employees to sign that would guarantee they would stay at the studio. This only further alienated the staff, and Roy responded that everyone refused to sign. Walt realized that Iwerks' warning to him was in fact legitimate. Walt was hurt by the betrayal, but not ready to throw in the towel. Instead, he approached Universal directly and offered to deal directly with them, cutting Mintz out altogether. Universal refused, stating they had already signed the contract to work with Mintz. As a last-ditch effort, Walt approached Fox and MGM and offered to produce Oswald for them instead of Universal. Unfortunately, Walt once again lacked the foresight to protect himself legally. Though he and Iwerks had created Oswald themselves, the contract he signed with Mintz left the Walt Disney Studio with absolutely no rights to the character. Walt had been bested. Though it was his own impatience and managing of the company that had driven his employees away, he felt a sharp betrayal from their actions. He had come to New York on a high, true success within his grasp, expecting a pay raise, and instead was met with this crushing blow. He lost the largest contract of his career thus far, a character he had created, and nearly all of his animators. Ub Iwerks was one of the very few who remained at the studio. With a heavy heart, he boarded a train back to Hollywood. So, yeah, he got ultra mega screwed over by Mintz for sure, but at the same time, from all the accounts that I've read, he himself was a pretty big pain to deal with at this time at the studio. So it's kind of hard to gauge who is really in the right and wrong on this one.
Yeah, but it's like you still want to root for him, even if he was a pain.
Though I will say, we do one of the biggest upticks for him. ride home began as one of the lowest points in Walt's career. Both he and Lillian were scared for both their own futures and that of the studio. With no contracts and no source of income on the horizon, Walt knew he would be facing another financial disaster if he didn't come up with something new. He needed something even better than Oswald. Now, this next part I'm going to get into, a lot of the Disney historians have argued over that Walt may have very much embellished the story, but it's too good of a story to pass up, so take it as you will.
Don't all good storytellers embellish, though?
Exactly. And who is a better storyteller than Walt? So as Walt told the story, he picked up a pencil and began sketching on the train stationery. He reminisced on a time back at Laugh-O-Gram, and in particular on one of the inhabitants of the studio. The Laugh-O-Gram studio was frequently home to a number of mice, much to the dismay of many of the women working there. Walt, though, seemed undeterred by their presence, and vice versa. Walt would claim that over time, one of the rodents even gathered enough courage to walk across his drawing board as he was sketching. He even began feeding him, and as he sat nibbling on a snack, Walt would make quick sketches of him. With that spark of imagination, Walt took pen to paper. On that long train ride back to Hollywood, a tired and beaten dreamer would create a character that had arguably the greatest influence on popular culture ever. A personality that would last for decade after decade, appearing in numerous films, television shows, books, and more. A face recognizable today by almost any man, woman, or child across the globe. What Walt came up with was a character that would not only help him and his studios rebound from their loss of Oswald, but eclipse the popularity of the Lucky Rabbit many times over. Walt drew a mouse who we all know today, a mouse named Mortimer.
There's the punchline.
I was waiting for it. I was like, come on.
Yeah, had to have it
People
build
don't
up
know
for that
this.
one.
It's because they haven't seen One Man's Dream,
Yes.
and that's a shame. So
That is a true shame. Anybody that has gone to Hollywood studios and does not watch One Man's Dream, you're missing out. When Walt presented his creation to Lillian, she later remarked that she had a hard time focusing on much else other than the name. The only thing that got through to me was a horrible name, Mortimer. I'm afraid I made quite a scene about it. Too sissy. Walt was taken aback. He sat down and thought about it and eventually came back to her with a new proposition. Perhaps the original name only seems strange now because we aren't familiar with it, or because it would be very hard to stay on tempo when spelling it out during the chant of the Mortimer Mouse Club March. We'll never truly know, but Walt's second name got the thumbs up from Lillian, and so Mickey Mouse was born.
So, wait. Was
Yep.
Lillian saying that Mortimer was too sissy of a name?
Yes, which seems weird because
That seems very
seems like a
opposite.
very manly.
Yeah.
Mortimer seems really sinister, honestly.
Mortimer is to me a very intimidating person.
Well,
I think
didn't
so.
Mortimer like kind of end up as this sinister version of Mickey, like in later years? I know that's kind of Pete, but like,
Well,
You're
I feel
right.
like he did kind of end up as a villain character.
yeah. The name itself to me, I imagine just like I don't know, creepy old man, like a butler in an old movie or something. So it's funny that she's like, oh, too sissy. No. But Mickey, that's good. That's not sissy at all. Also, did anybody, when you said the part about the chant of the Mortimer Mouse Club, did you try to do it in your head?
Oh, definitely. When I was writing this, I was like, oh, I wonder how it would sound. And then I was like, yeah, that doesn't work at all.
MORTIMER MOUSE.
I feel like I know we're kind of jumping ahead here, but like Mickey is one of those things that it's so iconic now that it's like it's hard to even imagine anything else in his place.
Yeah, for sure.
That's true, but I still think that Mortimer was just an awful name to go with.
It's definitely not as catchy.
But it wasn't just his original name that would be changed, but his appearance as well. Once arriving back in Hollywood, he showed his creation to Ub Iwerks and had him improve on the design. Ub gave Mickey his characteristic pear-shaped body and thin arms. This would allow him to be more easily animated. Remember, they were down on employees at this time, and also react to his environment more charismatically. While Walt may have created him, the Mickey that everyone came to know and love was born largely of iWorks' hand. Walt, Roy, and Ub sat down and began brainstorming a plot for Mickey's debut. Eventually, inspired by Charles Lindbergh's solo Atlantic Crossing, which had occurred the previous year, they came up with a plot in which Mickey would fly his own plane in order to impress a certain lady friend of his. Plane Crazy, Mickey's first film, was underway. The Disney Brothers and iWorks were not alone at the studio at this time, though. Now they were still under contract with Mintz to produce 3 more Oswald films over the next few months, and the animators who would be leaving to work with Harmon were still there to work on the Oswald films. The atmosphere during this time was tense, to say the least. Walt, obviously distrustful of nearly everyone there, had Ub Iwerks working alone in a private office on Plane Crazy. Walt's remaining team of loyalists were scraping by to produce the film, and they were having to do it with no upfront funds, as there wasn't even a distributor lined up yet. But Ub was as hardworking as he was faithful to Walt over the years. Walt allowed some of the other animators staying at the studio to help out with coloring, camera operation, and other tasks related to the film, but the animation was carried out single-handedly by Ub. He produced 700 drawings a day to churn out Plane Crazy as quickly as possible, and I think that is absolutely crazy. And another thing that I noticed that was very cool is that if you actually go and watch a copy of Plane Crazy, which you can just find on YouTube if you want, like it states in credits, it's a Disney production, but it is a film by Ub Iwerks, which I think is very cool that Walt gave him the credit because it was very clearly deserved.
Yeah, definitely.
Production began on April 30th of 1928. A week later, the last Oswald film was completed, and Harmon and the majority of the other animators left the studio. After just another week, on May 15th, Plane Crazy was finished, and I think that is ridiculous that Ub working almost solo, at least on the animation portion of this, knocked out this film in 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It took the small team many hours of overtime, often working long into the night to get it done, but done it was. The results, after 2 hellish weeks and nearly $1,800 in production costs, were somewhat primitive. The animation was crude, and the Mickey featured in the film was very unlike the Mickey the world would soon know. At times, he can be seen tugging at Minnie and even laughing at her when she falls from the plane to avoid his advances and has to use her bloomers as a parachute. And going back and rewatching this recently, it is pretty weird to see Mickey in this role because let's just say he's not very gentlemanly.
Did you know, I just did the math, that $1,800 in 1928 today would be $26,737.18.
Wow.
So.
And to spend that in 2 weeks, that's a lot of money. Upon its completion, Walt began pitching the film to distributors and theaters. While he was able to sell it to a number of local theaters and came close to securing a multi-film contract with Metro, the deal fell through and no one picked up Mickey for a series. Walt knew the only thing to do was go back to the studio and keep working at the films until someone was willing to pick them up. They produced Mickey's second film, The Galloping Gaucho, but the results were largely the same. Up until this point, the films that the studio had been producing, and nearly any film created thus far, were silent movies. But after screening Plane Crazy in one theater following The Jazz Singer, the first film to synchronize spoken word and music with images, the future was apparent to Walt. The next cartoon would do the same. This was no simple task in those days, and to even get started on the development took some creative thinking. The team first needed a way to match the animated frames with the music and sound effects that would come later. They eventually took each drawing sheet in order and would make one sheet in regular intervals an accent frame. So for example, if the music had measures that lasted through 8 frames of animation, every 8th frame would be what they called an accent frame, and they would put an accent mark on it. And here might be where a footstep might land, a character might contact an object, or some other notable occurrence in which a sound effect would need to be produced. And this made it way easier to line up the sounds later because it was occurring in beats just like music does.
Huh.
Yeah. And it's really cool if you do go back and watch it, that even if you cut the sound off, you can see everything that's happening in the film is happening to a repeating rhythm. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting. The plot of the film was a spoof of the Buster Keaton film Steamboat Bill Jr., cheekily named Steamboat Willie. Again, the staff pulled long nights working on the animation, excited about the possibilities that the film might hold. By early June, they had most of their animation completed. In late June, around 8 o'clock one night, the studio set up a quick preview of the concepts to some of their close friends. Roy set up a projector outside the studio, which would display the film through a window and onto a bedsheet that was hung in Walt's office. Walt positioned a few of the staff members with musical instruments and other sound-making devices behind his office door, which had a window that they could look through. One by one, the friends were led into the office and shown the film. As it played, the team would play music or tap a pencil against the spittoon in sync with the animation. The result was astounding. Guests were asking for encore after encore, mesmerized with the sounds that seemed to be emanating from the characters on the screen. The staff stayed up till 2 o'clock previewing Steamboat Willie and returned at 6 the next morning to begin finishing the work on it. They knew they were onto something big.
Finally, a success.
Just about to say,
almost.
Finally things are starting to look up. Woo!
The animation took another 4 completely finished, but even upon its completion, Walt had an issue. They had a way to have music and sound effects play along with the film without a live orchestra, which a live orchestra up till this point was just a bunch of people that worked for Walt kind of playing music and hitting things. He flew to New York to meet with a man named Pat A. Powers, who was developing a system known as CinemaPhone. The technology printed optical impulses in the margins of film that could be read by a sound head and a specialty projector, which would produce the sounds. So I don't know if you guys remember, this was almost kind of like a very, very early precursor to when we talked about how the Tiki Room managed lining up their sounds and movements, kind of in a backwards sense, though, because in the Tiki Room, they took audio files and embedded magnetic strips in them that would make the animatronic birds move in Tiki Room. But here they took the film, which was the visual aspect of it, and embedded these little optical impulses in them that would now make these specialty producers or specialty projectors make sound. So I thought that was kind of cool and kind of like an early but opposite kind of similar solution to the problem they were having.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the initial recording session was disastrous. A number of technical glitches plagued the recording, and on top of that, the conductor wasn't able to get the orchestra synced up with the film. The thing about Steamboat Willie was, though they were doing kind of the same thing that they had done in the initial screening of the film, different scenes in Steamboat Willie, while they are on their own, it's not the same tempo in each individual scene in it. So what was happening was that as the process was going, it was backwards to how animation is done today, where you record the lines and then you have the animators draw the action over the top of it. Here, they had already done all the animations and they were trying to have the orchestra and everybody doing the sound effects sync up with it. And on top of that, because of the technology of the day, you got one shot. Like, they had to do a full take through this, 6 to 7 minute film. And if anything happened, like that tape was scrapped. And one of them, it was kind of disheartening to hear the story, was like they had finally kind of gotten the audio with the orchestra synced up enough. and Walt was doing some of the I don't want to say voiceover work because it wasn't really voice acting. He was just doing some different sound effects and stuff, but he did the parrot that was in Steamboat Willie. And near the end of it, while he was trying to do one of the sound effects, he coughed and it ruined the entire take. And so basically,
come on, Walt.
I know.
You couldn't have held that
amateur
cough in.
hour.
Oh.
So yeah, but they ran into those issues, and again, because the tempo throughout the film isn't the same, the conductor of the orchestra was having a really, really hard time with changing up tempos and having them played at the right speed. So anyways, this first recording studio went very, very badly. Walt had sunk over $1,000 into the session with nothing to show for it. However, he devised a plan and got Roy to take out as many loans as possible to get funds for another session.
There it is.
As usual, he turned to Roy and made what almost anybody would say
I
is
ran
a
out of
terrible
money.
financial decision. It really does. It makes it. I mean, obviously, we know he found success. It's all paid off in the end. But at this point, Walt really does seem like starry-eyed, like early 20s millennial that has this awesome idea for a startup that keeps mooching money off of his parents to try to make it happen. It's just his brother in this case. But after he got Roy together, he came up with a pretty cool solution to make this work. He took the film, and because they had done the animation in such a way that they knew by the animation frames what the tempo and the beat of the music and the sound effects was supposed to be, he went back, took the originals, and he had a ball printed on the film, and it would rise and fall with the correct tempo of what the music and the sound effects were supposed to be that corresponded with the film. So as it changed from one scene to another within the film, the ball was rising and dropping at a different rate, and this gave the conductor kind of a frame of reference to look at, and now he was able to actually keep the orchestra in time. And once he did this, the results were flawless, and Walt finally had his film with synchronized sound. So I think it's pretty cool that, going back to the drawing board, it seems like such a simple solution, but it worked, and it kept them from having to completely scrap this project that, obviously became so successful. While in New York, Walt began trying to secure distributors for a Mickey Mouse series, using Steamboat Willie as an example. Initially, he was unsuccessful after meeting with Universal, Fox, Metro, and a number of smaller companies. Eventually, he met again with Pat Powers, who had decades of experience in the entertainment industry. Walt signed a contract that would empower Pat as the sole sales agent for the studio for 2 years and give him 10% of all profits during that time. Again, Walt is still young at this time. He's kind of in over his head in these, this big entertainment industry. And Roy's back at home while he's doing all this. So a lot of times when Walt was left to his own devices to make big decisions regarding finances, he kind of made bad decisions. And this will definitely come back as one of those.
Never let Walt handle the money.
No, Walt obviously creative, pushed technical boundaries and developed awesome new technology for all kinds of stuff. But dear Lord, the man could not handle even basic finances. However, even going to Pat, little to help their cause. After 2 months in New York, they still couldn't find a distributor. And even though funds were running low, Walt wrote Roy to scrape together any money that they could and start production on a fourth Mickey film, again, trying to utilize sound. So after taking out more loans from the bank, selling Walt's Moon Roadster and taking an additional mortgage out on both of their houses, he had done just that.
Womp womp.
So,
Jeez.
yeah. And at this point in time, again, we know it's going to work out for the best in the long run, but man, Roy kind of was enabling this behavior too. Like,
He just had faith in his brother.
that's a much brighter way to look at it.
Yeah, that's some strong faith.
Finally, after those 2 months of screening Steamboat Willie, Walt called a break. Henry Reichenbach was a theater owner in New York that just so happened to attend one of the screenings for one of the distribution companies that Walt was trying to snare. Reichenbach, obviously impressed, approached Walt to offer to run the films in his theater for $500. Walt was initially apprehensive. He believed showing Steamboat Willie in the theater before securing a deal with the distributor would make it do so. Reichenbach convinced him that it was exactly what the film needed. He told Walt that the distributors wouldn't want to sign up to a deal until they saw audience reactions. After sweetening the deal to $1,000, Walt agreed. And Reichenbach was right. After debuting the film in his theater, audience and critics alike marveled at it. Even the New York called it an ingenious piece of work. It was not the cartoon with sound, but it was the first that had been designed with sound as an integral part of it. With other cartoons, the sound effects added later seemed out of place and were only flashy additions to keep audience attention. And honestly, it's not even with other cartoons. If you go back and look at Plain Crazy, which you can watch on YouTube, or I'm sure there's plenty of other places, almost any version that you'll see have sound added to it, because after they had produced it and got some distribution deal, Walt and the studio went back and they added the music, they added sound effects to kind of, bring it up to speed with the other films that they were producing. But if you watch Plain Crazy and then you go and watch Steamboat Willie, like, it's very, very obvious that Plain Crazy had all the sound effects and stuff added afterwards. And Steamboat Willie is like, the music is the story almost. With Steamboat Willie, the cartoon couldn't exist without the sound. It was as much a part of the experience as anything, and the synchronization and level of sound detail was unlike any animated film before it. By mid-December, only a month after its first showing, Powers had secured a deal with the Stanley Fabian Warner Theaters in New York for $3,000 for each Mickey film the Walt Disney produced. Over the next few months, he had secured similar deals in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Cleveland, Minnesota. By the following May, they had secured deals along the entire West Coast. So at 27, after stumbling through the industry, Walt had found success. His attention to detail, unwillingness to compromise on quality, and adaptation of new technology had finally paid off. Steamboat Willie had become a national sensation, and the Walt Disney Studio had something they could be truly proud of. Even at this point, though, Walt, as headstrong and sure of himself as he was, couldn't fathom what his company would grow into over the following decades. But in the here and now was Mickey. He had lost his original name, his original appearance, and even his original personality, but had become the Mickey that generations would come to know. It was here, with this mouse, that it was all starting.
And the rest is history.
So yeah, I enjoyed this section, I think, maybe more than the other two that I've done so far, just because I really think that this is probably the like least talked about part of Walt's history. Is like, I mean, a lot of people know about the whole deal with Oswald and like Universal and how he kind of got screwed over, but like all the other stuff that he had to do to work through to get Steamboat Willie actually made, I think was like really, really eye-opening and cool to look into. So
yeah, definitely. I only wish that I had been this, I don't know what the right word is, ambitious at 27.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, like every time we dive into like a new section of his history. It's like he tried something, he got punched in the gut multiple times and just kept chugging along. Like,
Yeah, I don't think I would have probably been able to keep the faith after as many letdowns as he had.
oh, same here, definitely not.
And I think ambition is definitely one way to frame that. Ambition and a brother that's willing to fund all of your dreams.
That's a big part of it. And and especially no, Walt was very creative, but I wanted to pay special attention in this episode to Iwerks too, who really kind of like he was not only the workhorse, but also a lot of his own creativity was really what made Mickey. So I think he gets overlooked a lot in kind of like the history of the Disney Corporation. But I mean, he was in here at the beginning, like the early beginnings, like before the Walt Disney Studio was even the Disney Brothers Studio, and I think it's really cool to see that he stuck around for so long and made such a big impact to the company.
Yeah, definitely. He is such a main character that I feel like doesn't get the recognition that he often deserves.
Mm-hmm.
I really do wonder where, like, I know Walt has like a lot of, he gets a lot of the credit and everything for obvious reasons, but like I wonder where he would have made it without people like Roy or even like Iwerks in his life. Like,
Oh, I don't think he would have at all.
I wonder how fast he would have burnt out or spent all of his money and been homeless.
Yeah, definitely.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like he would have always had the ambition to try to keep doing it, but I don't think there was any chance of him actually finding success if he didn't have and Roy helping him out.
Yeah. That's actually part of the reason we wanted to name Eli after Roy also, because like there would be no Walt without Roy, in my opinion.
Oh,
I
definitely.
definitely think that that's a very accurate statement.
So I think we need to start a petition. Walt and Roy both have statues in Disney World. We need one for Iwerks too.
Oh yeah, that'd be awesome.
I feel like that should be at the animation studio, like where you can do the tour.
Oh, that
California.
would be awesome.
That would be a
all
good place for that.
Also, a little bit going back, but I wanted to talk about the fun fact / not necessarily confirmed, I don't think, how the villain in Up is, in my opinion, very obviously named after Charles Mintz because his name is Charles Muntz. But apparently that's never been confirmed. I don't really feel like they need to.
Yeah.
And that's going to do it for us this week. Thanks for joining us again on another episode of the Station 71 podcast. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from. If you want to read our show notes or find links to all of our social media, that can be found online at www.station71podcast.com. If you have anything you want to hear us talk about or any ideas for future episodes, be sure to email them to station71podcast@gmail.com. We hope you enjoyed your ride, and we'll see you real soon.
Please stand clear of the doors. Por favor, manténganse alejado de las puertas.